now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, Assistant Secretary General, thank you for convening this meeting of the Security Council to discuss the report of the human rights situation in Ukraine. I am grateful to Assistant Secretary General Ivan Simonovich for presentation of this report today. Today's meeting is held while on everybody's mind is the following fact. It is only because of the Russian military aggression, unimaginable in the 21st century, yet unfolding in our planned sight, that the situation in Ukraine has emerged on the Council agenda. Ukraine has welcomed the publication of the report, which objectively enough reflects the situation in my country in the field of human rights. Unlike the previous administration, the new government in Ukraine is willing and ready to embrace recommendations aimed at promoting human rights and rule of law in our country. At the same time, we hope that the other government mentioned in the report will also take specific actions in order to stop and prevent human rights violations. The document strongly rejects the allegations of violations of the Russian minority rights in Ukraine, which served as a reason for Russia's military aggression against our country and annexation of Crimea that was declared illegal by the General Assembly. My Russian colleague stated today that Russian language is in danger in Ukraine. Let me give you some comparative figures on situation around protection of language rights of several million Ukrainians in Russian Federation and Russians in Ukraine. Figures are based on the report of OSCE High Commission on National Minorities dated March-April 2009. Please compare figures. Secondary schools. There are no Ukrainian secondary schools in the Russian Federation for at least 2 million people. In Ukraine, there are 1,256 Russian secondary schools. Publications. 7 Ukrainian papers are published at the expense of the local authorities and Ukrainian organizations of the Russian Federation. Financial support at the federal level is not provided to ensure the information needs of the Ukrainian community in Russian Federation. 1,176 newspapers are published in the Russian language in Ukraine. Broadcasting. There is only one Ukrainian broadcast radio program in Russia. Russian language TV and radio programs in Ukraine take around 74% of the total broadcasting in Ukraine. Russian colleague today and permanently stated about the growing anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism in Ukraine. And Russian side is concerned about the absence of these notions in the report on human rights today. Let me quote some excerpts from the collective letter of Association of 266 Jewish Organizations of Ukraine. This letter addressed to the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, not long ago. I quote, "The speculation about the violent Ukrainization and the prohibition to speak in Russian, which was always stressed in the Russian media, should remain on these authors' conscience. Your, Mr. President, confidence expressed on the growth of anti-Semitism in Ukraine does not meet the real facts. Perhaps you were confused indicating Ukraine instead of Russia, where Jewish organizations have documented the growth of anti-Semitism last year. We were, and still we are, being frightened by the fact that Banderas and fascists are rushing to power in Ukraine, and we should expect the Jewish pogroms. Yes, we are aware that political opposition and the social protest powers that achieved positive changes in the executive branch of the country are made up of different groups. The nationalists are among them, but even the most marginal of them do not allow themselves to express the anti-Semitism and the other forms of xenophobia. And what we know that our nationalists are under control of the civil society and new government of Ukraine, which is not the case with the Russian neo-Nazis who are encouraged by your secret services. End of quote. Today, our Russian colleague also touched upon this case around Mr. Tsaryov and Mr. Dobkin as the candidates to the presidential elections. I'm authorized to say that we condemn all forms of violence, especially when it concerns the opposition leaders and candidates for president. In this context, the word must be said by the police, who are obliged to carry out a proper investigation and submit it to the court. Today, the Ukrainian parliament considered these cases, and we expect that it will be well assessed, and the prosecutor office will make the comments on that. But what is also interesting in that situation, I would like to note that in the current situation, coupled with the aggressive actions against Ukraine, cannot be excluded and provocations from our opponents. Note that Mr. Tsaryov was attacked by unknown assailants and rescued. Those who rescued him were from the right sector, precisely the right forces that constantly being accused by Russia in extreme intolerance to Russia. Mr. Tsaryov openly thanked representatives of this power for the salvation. This story was broadly broadcasted in the main news channels in Ukraine. We have this full version on the disk, and we will give it to the Russian colleagues because the Russian TV channels demonstrate only part of that interview. We call on the United Nations member states to take close note of the human rights violations detailed in the report before and during the Crimea pseudo-referendum of March 16, including harassment, arbitrary arrest, torture, violations of freedom of expression, media freedom, access to information, and the protection of journalists. Particular attention is rightly given to the violations of the rights of the inhabitants of the peninsula under the Russian occupation. The most vulnerable communities in IRC are considered to be the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians, who were intimidated and forced to leave their homes because of lack of safe environment and oppression of their rights and freedoms. Tatars leaders consider this situation as the third act of genocide against their ethnic group for the last century. Given the ongoing systematic violations of the human rights on the Crimean Peninsula, the Ukrainian side insists that the situation in the Autonomous Republic should remain under the radar of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and its mission and other international monitoring mechanisms. In this respect, we welcome the intention of the UN Monitoring Mission to establish its sub-office in Simferopol. Mindful of the provisions of the General Assembly Resolution, Territorial Integrity of Ukraine. Alarming is the fact that along with the analysis of recent developments and factors in the eastern regions of Ukraine, the document reports on the external interference in the situation, in particular the participation in the protests and clashes of individuals who arrived from Russia. At Security Council meeting last Sunday, we gave some facts of such interference. You can find much more evidence by visiting official site of Ukrainian Secret Service, SBU. Ukraine is surprised that the only criticism of peace enforcement operation in Ukraine comes from the Russian Federation. You will recall this that this country is one of the most frequent users of the counter-terrorism tools against its citizens. I would like to draw your attention that in all counter-terrorism operations, Russia uses the same scheme. If the enemy does not surrender, it is stormed at any cost. Dozens of the examples could be given. Peace enforcement operation in Ukraine is undertaken to protect people, restore law and order in some regions of Ukraine. The operation is targeted exclusively at armed groups committing acts of criminal nature, including seizures of administrative buildings, police and military facilities, and airports. Those armed groups are strongly supported by the Russian Special Operations Force units, illegally infiltrated into the territory of Ukraine. My Russian colleague mentioned today that the first blood appeared in the eastern Ukraine. It is the blood of 5 Ukrainian peace enforcement officers killed in a well-prepared attack governed by the Russian officer Igor Strelkov. You can find this detailed information on the mentioned site of Ukrainian Secret Service, www.sbu.government.com. It is in this light that we look forward to the missions next, which will be focused on eastern Ukraine. Madam President, the United Nations experts stated clearly that a number of human rights violations in other parts of Ukraine were a heritage of the previous government, which became one of the main reasons that caused the Ukrainian mass protests in November 2013 through February 2014. Those reasons challenging human rights in Ukraine generally and in its eastern and southern regions particularly for decades are well known: poverty, high level of child mortality, unemployment, dangerous working conditions, especially in coal mining industry. As a result, basic human rights principles provisioned by the Constitution of Ukraine were not always respected in my country. The only solution for Ukraine to cope with those problems is to change dramatically the inherited status quo in favor of building of an open democratic civil society. The newly formed parliamentary coalition and the government of Ukraine have repeatedly stated their commitment to reforms aimed at eliminating those vestiges of the past. And we are grateful to the authors of the report that they have noted positive trends in the activities of the newly formed Ukrainian authorities, which indicate willingness to ensure a break with past injustices and to elaborate a new vision of Ukrainian future. The government's action plan presented by the new cabinet is inclusive as to the problems of each and every region of Ukraine. It is focused on practical needs of the population, including ethnic minorities. What we need to achieve these goals is that Russia leaves us in peace. Madam President, we highly appreciate the role the United Nations is playing to normalize the situation in Ukraine and are ready to enhance the cooperation with the human rights bodies of the United Nations for the proper consideration of human rights issues in the implementation of the wide-ranging reforms. These reforms are aimed at ensuring the rule of law, development of democratic, pluralistic society, elimination of corruption, compliance with social standards, and protection of rights of minorities. The real watershed in this process will be presidential elections in Ukraine on May 25th. We are determined to have them under all circumstances and to make these elections the most transparent in the history of independent Ukraine. I thank you all for your support and understanding. Thank you, Madam President.